Pull your chair close to the fire once more, and give it your attention. Every cleric begins somewhere. In the great temples of the civilized world, they begin with doctrine and liturgy and the formal ceremonies of investiture. In the realm's wilder places, the borderlands, the healing shops, the quiet rooms above ordinary streets, they begin with a grandmother's hands on their wrists, and a question neither of them is quite ready to answer yet. This is the account of the Brighthammer women, 3 generations of healers whose relationship with the still waters moved from devotion to service to inheritance. The inheritance was complicated. It always is. By the time Yarena Brighthammer was old enough to grind herbs without spilling half the mortar, her grandmother had already become part of Millbrook's furniture. Yarena Brighthammer sat where the light was best in the narrow-fronted healing shop, her back to the little window, her hands moving with patient certainty through roots and leaves and old scarred wooden tools. People came and went, farmers with cracked hands, children with fevers, woodcutters with splinters deep as thorns, and they all called her Maren or Gran, as if she had always been there. Only Yarena knew that was not true. There were clues, if one knew where to look. A little twist of accent when Maren named plants that did not grow near Millbrook. The way her gaze would follow travellers' stories when caravans passed through, not with idle village curiosity, but with the quick, hungry attention of someone measuring roads she had once walked. The old, scuffed satchel that never left her room upstairs, whose leather bore stamps and stains from places no one in Millbrook could name. "Where did you live before here?" Yarena asked once, when she was 10 winters and too old for stories meant for children. Maren was binding a sprain, her gnarled fingers surprisingly gentle around a boy's swollen ankle. "Many places," she said. "A house near the sea where the air tasted of salt. A hospice on a hill where the sick came from miles around. A little room over a baker's shop where the walls were thin and the bread was good." She tied off the bandage and gave the boy his instructions. "Up you get. Don't run on it, and don't argue with your mother." When the door had closed, Yarena persisted. "Why here? Millbrook is small." Maren smiled at that, a crinkle of lines around eyes that still saw too much. "Small is not the same as empty, little bird. Your maps are too short." She paused, her gaze drifting toward the tree line visible past the market roofs. "There is a spring hidden under the shadow of this forest. I dreamt of it when I was a girl. A pool so still that the stars could see themselves properly, without the world's fuss getting in the way. I saw a cottage near it and a village with smoke on the air, and I knew that if I ever reached that place, I was meant to stay." "Shadow Vale?" Yarena whispered. "Aye, Shadow Vale. The spring is real, though the dream made it prettier than the truth, as dreams do. I found it, and I knew I'd wandered enough. The gods do not always shout, child. Sometimes they whisper a place into your bones and wait to see if you're paying attention." She said nothing more that day. But from then on, Yarena could not look at her grandmother without hearing that unspoken before. All the roads Maren had walked to end up here, in a narrow shop in a small village at the edge of an old wood. Curiosity settled into her like a seed, deep and patient. In winter, when snow made the road impassable and caravans stayed away, the shop's main room smelled of smoke and drying herbs and whatever stew Lysa had on the back of the stove. Yarena Brighthammer moved through that room with practiced efficiency, all brisk warmth and no mysteries. She knew every ache by its name, and every villager by their limp or cough. She spoke little of gods and nothing of dreams. Her world was poultices and coin, and making sure the shutters were barred before a storm. Maren, by contrast, grew talkative in bad weather. "Hand me the willow bark," she said one icy evening. "No, the older bundle. The newer is for fevers. The old has a deeper bite." Her fingers brushed Yarena's as the girl passed it, and for a heartbeat, Yarena felt something like a tingle. No more than the prickle of standing too close to a thundercloud, but unmistakable. "Gran," Yarena ventured, "in your dream, when you saw the spring, did you know whose spring it was?" Maren's hands did not pause in their work. She shaved the bark into the mortar, the knife making a quiet, steady rhythm. "There are some pools the still waters favours," she said at last. "Places where Elindra's hand rests heavier on the world. People find peace there more easily. Sleep comes gentler. Dying does too." "You came here to be near a place like that?" "I came because I was tired," Maren said simply. "Tired of tending hundreds in great stone halls. Tired of hearing 100 last words a week. I wanted to listen to one person at a time, to know their names, to see them again after they left the bed." A faint smile touched her lips. "Millbrook is slow." I liked the thought of slow. It was not the answer Yarena had expected. No tales of fleeing wars or following saints. Just a woman who had seen too much and chosen quietly to see less, but to see it more clearly. At night, when the fire burned low and Lysa had gone to bed, Yarena would steal looks at Maren's face in the half-dark. There were lines there that did not come from this village. There were stories she did not tell. Yarena's curiosity grew sharper, not just about where her grandmother had been, but about what exactly she had been. Healer, yes, but something more too, if the way people spoke of her in lowered voices was any sign. "Old Maren," they said. "She's seen things. If she sits by your bed, you'll either get better or you'll go easy. One way or another, the hurting ends." The accident happened in late autumn of the same year Dane Weilmark first began his lessons with Gareth, as if the world were running 2 experiments simultaneously and wished to compare the results. The woodcutters brought Thomas in on a makeshift stretcher, his face white beneath the grime, a strip of cloth tied tight around his forearm, and everything below it soaked dark. "A hatchet slipped," one of the others said, breathing hard. "It caught him bad, Maren." But Lysa was away at a birth, gone since morning with no certainty of her return before dawn. Maren had been upstairs all week with a chest cough that had refused to improve. Yarena was alone in the shop when the door burst open. She was 13 years old. "Put him here," she said, surprised at the steadiness of her own voice. She did what she had been taught. She cut the binding away with careful hands, identified the wound. Deep, badly positioned, bleeding with purpose, and packed it with clean cloth to assess what she was actually dealing with. She boiled water. She worked with the systematic competence of someone who had watched this work performed hundreds of times and had paid complete attention every time. But as she pressed down on the wound, Thomas gave a ragged sound that was almost a sob. "Don't let me lose the arm, girl," he said. His eyes were unfocused with pain. "Can't work with one." Yarena swallowed. The wound was worse than clean pressure would manage. She was 13 years old, her mother was a mile away, and there was a man bleeding on the table in front of her. Her hands did something before her mind had finished deciding what to do. She set her palms lightly around the wound, not squeezing, not applying pressure the way the textbook said, but enclosing. The way you might cup water you don't want to spill. Something in her body knew this gesture, even though her mind had not been taught it. For a moment, everything narrowed. The woodcutter's noise in the doorway faded. The rafters went distant. She felt the warmth of Thomas's skin, the hot pulse of blood trying to force its way past torn flesh. And then, rising through her from somewhere that was not inside the room, a coolness, not external, not a draft or a salve. Something moving through her arms to where her hands framed the wound. Gentler than her own fear, steadier than her own racing thoughts. The blood slowed. She lifted the cloth. The wound was drawing its edges together in a way that should have taken days, not heartbeats. Not knitting whole, not miracle healing, nothing like that. But the worst of the torn tissue pulling in, the bleeding thinning to a sluggish ooze. "How did you do that?" one of the woodcutters breathed. "I didn't," Yarena said quickly. "It must have been cut less deep than it looked. Help me wrap it." They did. Within minutes, Thomas was sitting up, pale but no longer ashen. Yarena sent them away with instructions and watched the door close, then stood alone in the middle of the room, flexing her tingling hands. Maren appeared at the doorway from the stairs a moment later, wrapped in her shawl, eyes sharper than they had any right to be on a woman who'd been coughing all week. "I heard raised voices," she said. Her gaze went immediately to Yarena's hands. "What did you do?" Yarena opened her mouth to deny everything, closed it, reached for the safe explanation, and set it aside. Because she was 13 years old, and she had just felt something pass through her that she could not fit inside a safe explanation. Maren stepped closer. She took Yarena's wrists lightly, turned her palms upward, said nothing for a long moment. "Once in a great while," Maren said almost casually, "the gods lean in a little closer than usual. A hand steadies. A cut closes better than it ought. A fever breaks quicker than it has any right to. We don't build our lives on that. But we'd be fools not to notice." "Was that what that was?" Yarena asked. "I don't know," Maren said. "And neither do you. Yet." She let go of Yarena's wrists. "Curiosity is a sharp tool, child. Keep it, but don't stab yourself with it. Some answers only come when you're ready to live with them." She turned back toward the stairs, moving slower than usual. Yarena stood very still in the quiet shop, hands cooling, mind entirely awake. Maren Brighthammer's last winter came in the year Dine turned 15, which is to say, 2 years into his training with Gareth. And the same autumn, the courier Halric had ridden in from the north with word of Lady Vera's plans. Millbrook was, that year, a village sitting on top of something it did not yet know was there. A pressure building beneath the ordinary surface of commerce and weather, and the small human dramas of a borderland settlement. Maren felt it, though she said nothing of that kind. She spoke only of her lungs and her knees, and the cold that seemed to come through the walls no matter what they did about the insulation. "Age will have its way," she said, when Yarena fussed. "I've bargained with enough bodies to know when I'm not getting a better price. She kept working as long as she could, sitting by bedsides with that quiet, solid presence that steadied frightened souls even when there was little else to be done. Yarena watched, helped, learned to brew the right teas and say the right simple prayers over the right preparations. She did not feel again the coolness she had felt with Thomas's wound. But she watched her grandmother more carefully than she ever had, with the focused attention of someone who understands, for the first time, that what they are watching will not be available to watch indefinitely. One night, the cough took Maren hard. She lay in her narrow bed under the sloping roof, breath rasping, snow tapping at the window. Lisa sat at one side, Yarena at the other. "No fuss," Maren said between breaths. "No wailing. I chose a slow place. I've had a full turn of seasons. Don't ruin it with dramatics." Liza's eyes shone. "You could have stayed in those grand houses, with their marble halls and priests in white. Why end your days above a draughty shop?" Maren smiled, the expression faint but unmistakable. "Because here I remembered people's names, and they remembered mine. Big halls forget you as soon as you're gone." Her gaze moved to Yarena. "Don't let anyone tell you a life must be loud to be full." Yarena wanted to ask 100 questions. About the spring, about the places Maren had walked, about what exactly had happened that autumn afternoon with Thomas's wound. Her tongue felt heavy. None of them felt kind to put on a dying woman. "Gran," she managed, "if there's anything you meant to tell me, now would be a good time." Maren's eyes fixed on her granddaughter's face with the careful weight of a woman assessing what to say and what to withhold. Then she shook her head just once. "Curious to the last," she murmured. "Good. You'll need that. The gods are patient. They don't drop everything in your lap at once. But there are things I did not finish. Questions I left to rust." Her hand drifted to her collarbone, to the leather thong she had worn beneath her dress for as long as Yarena could remember. Help an old fool. Yarena leaned forward and worked at the thong until it loosened. A small weight slid into her palm, a pendant, no larger than the pad of her thumb, of some metal that had once been silver and had darkened with years of close keeping. Its surface was smooth with handling, edges worn soft. At first she thought it was simply a circle. Then, as she turned it in the candlelight, she saw the etching. 3 shallow ripples engraved within the disc, concentric and spare. The symbol of Elindra, the still waters. "I wore that too long," Maren said quietly. "Habit. Fear. Both. Take it, Yarena. You've better use for it than a woman on her last bed." Maren reached out and closed Yarena's fingers around the pendant. For a heartbeat, Yarena felt again a hint of that coolness from Thomas's wound, the sense of something larger moving just at the edge of her awareness. "You'll understand it in your own time," Maren said. "Don't go chasing voices that haven't called you yet, but don't ignore them when they do." Her breath hitched. The next came shallower. Lisa murmured a prayer to Myrene, words worn and well used. Yarena held her grandmother's hand, and for once did not ask any more questions. Yarena Brighthammer died just before dawn, as the first light began to turn the snow outside the window from grey to pale blue. They laid her out in the shop downstairs, as was custom, candles at head and feet. Villagers came in ones and twos to pay respects. They spoke quietly of births eased, pains soothed, deaths made bearable. Yarena stood by, the pendant of Elindra cold now against her skin, and listened. Every story was another thread in a life she had glimpsed only in fragments. Yarena waited until her mother went to the tannery. Lysa had left with a basket and a muttered list of people to check on. Old Hara's hip, the miller's lingering cough. Aldrich's hands cracked from the vats. The moment the shop door shut, the little room above seemed to lean inward, listening. She had already done the proper sorting. What remained were the things no one had quite known what to do with. The battered satchel, the scuffed boxes, the stack of notebooks tied with twine. Lisa had said, not unkindly, "Leave the rest for another day." Then she'd gone downstairs and changed the subject whenever Yarena's hand drifted toward the stairs. Another day had come. Yarena knelt by the bed and slid the old satchel out from where it lived, the leather softened by decades of travel and use. Inside were papers, not neat titled books, but soft-edged notebooks, folios of loose pages, scraps of parchment pinned together. The handwriting shifted from leaf to leaf, Maren's cramped script here, broader hands there, the occasional note in a style Yarena did not recognize at all. She spread them around her in a rough circle, on herbs that grow near temple stones, on fevers that listen to song, on the spring under Shadow Vale, and why it will not take offerings of iron. She read quickly at first, eyes catching on familiar names, Elindra, Marin, the Old Oak, and unfamiliar ones from far towns and halls. This was not a single book of doctrine. It was a lifetime of careful theft. Wisdom taken from hospices and cloisters and backroom talks, stolen onto paper and carried away. Near the bottom of the stack, she found a slim volume bound in darker leather than the rest. It had no title. The first pages were blank, as if someone had meant to begin and never had. Yarena flipped forward, expecting more emptiness. Instead, halfway through, she hit ink. The writing on that page was unmistakably Maren's, but looser than her usual script, addressed to no one and unmistakably to someone. "If you're reading this without my say-so, Yarena, then your curiosity has finally chewed through the leash." Yarena froze. She kept reading. "I always thought it would be you. Lisa has a good heart but no taste for the edges. You, on the other hand, have never met a closed door you didn't wonder about. I've watched you watching me hide things since you were old enough to stand." There are three kinds of knowing in our work. The first is skill. Herbs, bones, where to press when someone is bleeding. Your mother has that in plenty. The second is listening. To breath, to fear, to the room. You have that too, whether you like it or not. The third is what the gods do when they lean in close. It has a name. In the temples, they call it divine favor. In the borderlands, we call it the touch. You felt it once with Thomas. You will feel it again. The difference next time is that you will recognize it, and recognizing it, you will have a choice to make. The next line was underlined, the strokes a little shakier. You know the spring I showed you once under Shadow Vale's boughs, the one that stays still even in wind. Follow the path there, but don't stop at the water. Go a dozen paces farther in, where the roots begin to twist up like fingers. There is a hollow there, beneath an old stone. I left a satchel in that hollow when I decided I was done running roads. I meant to dig it up again when I was ready to be more honest with myself. Turns out I never got around to that. Take what's there. Use it or don't, as the gods and your own good sense lead you. But know this: I did not come to Millbrook empty-handed, and neither will you leave it if it comes to that. At the bottom, in smaller script: if you're wise, you'll tell your mother none of this until you've decided what it means to you. She worried enough over me. No need to give her more shadows to chase. Yarena sat back on her heels, the room suddenly too small. She was on her feet and reaching for her cloak before she had quite admitted the choice to herself. Shadowvale, in early spring, was a thin place between seasons. Old snow clinging in the shadows. New green pushing up where the light managed to slip through. Yarena walked with care, boots finding the path more by memory than by sight. She knew this trail. Maren had brought her here once in childhood, to show her the spring that doesn't know how to ripple properly. The memory came back in pieces. Her small hand in Maren's, the hush the forest seemed to put on itself around the pool. The way her grandmother had said quietly, "Listen here when you can't hear yourself anywhere else." The spring was where she remembered it, cupped in a bowl of stone and root. Its surface was as calm as ever, reflecting only the grey sky and the fringe of branches overhead. Even the wind seemed to step lightly around it. She murmured a simple greeting and turned away from the pool as the note had instructed. Beyond it, the ground rose slightly. Roots of an old oak, older than the village, perhaps older than any story she knew, coiled up out of the earth like the backs of sleeping animals. Moss had claimed the hollows between them. Here and there, someone had tucked small offerings into those crevices. A smooth river stone, a plait of dried grass, a shard of broken pottery with 3 faint ripples scratched into the clay. A shrine of sorts. Not the tidy shelf and carved image the village kept for its gods, but a place where someone had been talking to the divine in their own, quieter language. Yarena counted her steps. At 12, she stood before a particular knot of roots half embracing a flat stone. The stone's surface was worn smooth in the way only hands make smoothness over time. Someone had knelt here many times before. She set down her basket and knelt. Her fingers traced the edge of the stone and felt it wobble faintly. She set her palms beneath its lip and levered it up. Beneath, a dark hollow lined with old, compacted earth. And there, wrapped in oiled cloth gone grey with age, was a satchel. It was smaller than the one upstairs, built for carrying on a belt rather than over a shoulder. Thick leather, simple buckles made for function rather than display. It was heavier than it looked. Yarena lifted it out carefully and set it on the moss, undid the ties and unfolded the cloth. Inside, wrapped and nested against one another, were tools. A compact canvas pack, straps stained with old sweat but still sound. A tightly bound bedroll, a stoppered waterskin still supple with oil, a bundle of simple practical clothes, a neatly coiled rope, and laid along one side of the satchel as if it were its spine, a weapon. It was not a great war hammer or a farmer's axe. It was a mace of modest size, the sort a travelling priest might wear at their belt. A short haft, wrapped in well-kept leather, topped with a flanged head shaped less for battlefield brutality than for certainty. Its metal had the dull sheen of something carefully maintained and long unused. At the centre of the flanges, where they met, the metal opened into a small, deliberate hollow. Yarena stared. Maren had never carried a weapon, not in all the years Yarena had known her. "Were you someone else?" Yarena whispered. "Before you were my grandmother." The spring behind her lay still. The pendant at her throat grew very warm. Tucked between the satchel's seams, she found a small piece of paper. She drew it out and unfolded it with fingers that barely trembled. "If you've gone this far, you've already decided you'd rather ask forgiveness than permission. Good. You'll need that stubbornness. These tools saw me through more roads than I had any right to walk. They were given to me when I first swore myself to the still waters, to her hearths, and to the people who need her calm. They're ordinary things: pack, bed, water, a bit of metal for when words fail. But in the hands of someone who listens, they are enough." A second line, thinner, the ink running. "You've worn the pendant long enough to know it isn't just decoration. Look at its back. Look at the mace. Then decide." Yarena set down the note. Her hand went to the pendant at her throat, and for the first time she turned it over. The back was not entirely flat. There was a faint ridge, a lip, as if the metal had once sat in some other setting and been carefully worked free. She looked from pendant to mace, to the hollow at the head center. Back again. "You cannot be serious," she said. To Maren, to Elindra, to the still spring behind her, she wasn't certain. She lifted the mace in her left hand, feeling its balance. Honest, workmanlike, neither too light nor too heavy. With her right, she slid the pendant's thong over her head. For a heartbeat, the little disc dangled between her fingers, bright against the forest's muted colours. Then she set it over the hollow in the mace's head. It fit as if the metal had remembered the shape it had been made for. There was no flash of light, no roll of thunder. The forest did not roar to life, and no voice boomed her name. But Yarena felt unmistakably a click. Not sound, not even a sensation in her hands. Something inside her chest, ever so slightly misaligned for years without her knowing it, sliding into true. The pendant settled, its 3 engraved ripples forming the center of the mace's head, as if they had always been there. For a second, the metal felt warm from within. A faint wash of cool moved up the haft into her palm and up her arm. The memory of stepping ankle-deep into the spring in summer. She gasped, more at the familiarity than the strength of it. It faded almost immediately, leaving behind only the solid reality of wood and metal, and the faint, persistent sense that she was no longer simply holding a tool. She was holding an answer. Yarena exhaled slowly. "So," she said into the listening trees, "you weren't just a healer in other people's halls. You were this. A cleric." She did not put that word to it yet. But she understood. Maren had borne a symbol not just at her throat, but in her hand. Someone the goddess had trusted to carry the still waters into places that needed it. Brighthammer. She had never asked what the name meant. Now, looking at the little weapon cradled across her knees, the answer seemed obvious. This was not a soldier's hammer. It was a bright hammer, a thing that could break, yes, but held up in a sick room so the dying had something to fix their eyes on besides fear, so the living had something to believe in besides the darkness. Her hands tingled. Not with power, not yet. With possibility. She wrapped the mace carefully in the oiled cloth, and slid it into the satchel alongside the other tools. She tied the straps down tight and slung the whole of it over her shoulder. It settled against her back with a familiarity that was not yet hers. That might be one day. Behind her, the spring lay still. The faint trickle of some hidden feeder stream whispered under the surface. "Thank you," she said, to Maren, to Elindra, to the quiet, watching presence she could not yet name. "I'll try to be worth the trouble." No answer came. But as she turned back toward the village, the air along the path felt a fraction clearer, and the weight on her back a fraction more right. She had not called for any of this. She had only gone snooping where she wasn't invited. And the gods, it seems, had been waiting for exactly that. Now we have them. A ranger who does not yet wear the name openly, and a cleric who has only just held her calling in her hands. Two young people in a small village at the edge of a wood that whispers of things larger than the lives currently being lived around it. Lady Vera's tax collectors are 2 harvests away. The goblin territorial markers in the Shadow Vale are months cold. The stag has not been seen since Gareth's encounter 15 years ago. Or if it has, no one has said so where the records could find it. The world is not yet in motion. Not quite yet.